Hello and welcome to this 3DO webinar preview. This is a small sample of the original presentation, but if you'd like to view the full webinar, please click the link in the description below.
Okay, well, I'm excited to talk about today's agenda, which is all about sustainability and manufacturing. The title of today's webinar is Manufacturing the Future. And, as you see in every third headline in the news, climate change and what's happening with the environment is really a top priority of governments, people, and companies all around the world. And a topic that comes up a lot, at least in my world, and if you're in additive manufacturing, 3D printing, I'm sure you're hearing more and more about this as well, is how sustainable is additive manufacturing net? What is the impact of 3D printing versus other manufacturing technologies? And definitely the research is early here and not definitive, but there's a lot of interesting news coming out and studies are happening, and a lot of money is going towards understanding this so that we can manufacture a more sustainable future. So today's agenda is environmental impact of manufacturing, period. And if you're like me, you'll be surprised to see just how wide the environmental impact is and how widely we should be looking at this. Next, we'll talk about the benefits of sustainability. And then we'll get into 3D printing specifically with sustainability, and then more moving towards the sustainable futures, how we'll kind of round out the presentation. So kicking off first with the environmental impact of manufacturing. Manufacturing is huge. The world of manufacturing is a multi-trillion-dollar world. And I throw this up there and I make that comment just to observe, my comments today are when I group or categorize conventional or traditional manufacturing, and we categorize 3D printing, you likely know that it's very hard to bucket like all different types of manufacturing. Like a semiconductor fab is very different from an automotive factory, is very different from a company making, pumps, for example. And so these are going to be really broad-based assertions, and I think it's just important to kind of note that as an initial caveat. When we think about environmental impact, it's much more than the factory. The factory is clearly a very important piece of sustainability and considerations along those lines, but everything that happens before the factory and after the factory, even all the way through to waste disposal and potential recycling of products, should be considered when we think about environmental impact. And I found this image online of two important ways to look at it. One is life cycle inventory, and this is emissions into the environment, resources used. And then the other that you see a lot more commonly is LCIA or LCA, which is life cycle assessment. And really, life cycle assessment takes into account everything that happens before and after the factory. And here you can see the highlighted traditional approach is kind of what we normally think about when we think, what is the environmental impact of manufacturing? You're thinking about the factory, and you're probably thinking about transportation of goods. But you look at what happens in a life cycle assessment, which is how kind of the environmentalists or the researchers who are looking into environmental impact are starting to really rally around the idea of a life cycle assessment and a holistic perspective of everything required. Like I said, even down to the reuse, recycling, recovery, and disposal of product. I'm not going to go through every detail, and we will definitely share the slides after the presentation, so you'll be able to study these more if you like later. Looking at the environmental impact of US manufacturing and its suppliers, as an example of this, you look at the suppliers and the factory as a percent, and NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has said that the manufacturing portion of the environmental impact is just 17%. And it's also noteworthy in that same article, they're talking about manufacturing specifically, where everything else is staying relatively flat by 2050. Manufacturing will see an increase of emissions of 26% by 2050, which is where 3D printing comes in, is in the factory, specifically looking at emissions and other environmental impacts. So as we talk about environmental impact in manufacturing, we're talking about, of course, CO2 emissions. What is the carbon footprint of the emissions, and then how does that impact overall air quality? Just looking at broadly looking at environmental impact. Within manufacturing, we also look at a lot of material waste. CNC machining can be the worst offender here, where you have your buy to fly ratio in aerospace is like a 12 or 13 to 1, meaning over 90% of the material ends up in the waste bins, like you see here. But even beyond material waste of the actual process, you actually have a lot of byproduct of waste that can't be recycled, needs to be disposed of in one way or another. You also have energy usage. This is the best image I could come up with for energy. And manufacturing uses a lot of energy. I was able to find of industrial energy consumption, manufacturing uses 77% of all industrial energy consumption. Mining uses 12%, construction 7%, and agriculture is only 5%. So there's a Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company. Again, semiconductors tend to be very use a lot of resources in their manufacturing process. Believe it or not, TSMC uses 7.2% of all of Taiwan's electricity, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about how much energy it actually requires. Obviously, like I said, manufacturing is a big world. Different processes use different amounts of energy, but in terms of environmental impact, manufacturing energy usage is a big one. Another one that you don't think about too often is the water impact. The manufacturing industry consumes 20 to 40% of annual fresh water in various developed countries. And just as an example of this, again, with semiconductor fabs, Intel in 3 months in its Arizona plant consumed 927 million gallons of fresh water, which, if it helps, that's enough to fill 1,400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. At the same time, with water comes energy, is 561 million kilowatt hours of energy. So it's just huge in terms of the impact. And that's why, because it has a big impact on the environment, that's why a lot of governments and companies and people are looking at how can we move manufacturing to a more sustainable future. Obviously, the benefits of sustainability are huge, and we see right now India, for example, is going through a huge heat wave. They're hitting the highest temperatures that they've ever hit, about 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and there is a climate disaster looming. If you're like me, oftentimes this can feel abstract. You don't really feel it as much, but you hear about it a lot. So if that wasn't enough reason to move towards a more sustainable future, the EPA also gives us many reasons to go green in manufacturing, and it ultimately boils down to you can make more money if you also go towards sustainability. You increase your operational efficiency by reducing cost, reducing waste. Obviously, if you're using less material, you're going to have less waste. You can respond to new customers. You can increase your competitive advantage. And of course, consumers more and more are asking, what is the environmental impact? You can strengthen and protect your brand and your reputation. You build public trust, where you can become a participant in the climate change turnaround rather than being a bystander and watching it. And you can also build long-term business viability. That's important if, for example, governments start cracking down on manufacturing in terms of energy usage, or, for example, water usage. You'll see a lot of this in the coming years. If you're able to find a way to use less water, for example, it might actually work towards your long-term business viability. And that kind of ties into the regulatory constraints and opportunities. So there are a lot of reasons why to go green that are beyond just an abstract idea of the climate. It can also be you make more money as a company. So 3D printing specifically, how does 3D printing play into sustainability, and is it more energy efficient? Is it using less waste. I'd say there's a lot of potential of additive manufacturing. And I think in our day-to-day, those of us in the industry using additive manufacturing, 3D printing, see the potential.
Thank you for watching this webinar preview from 3DO. To view the full webinar, please click the link in the description below. If you'd like to learn more about 3DO, please visit our website at www.3deo.co.